Welcome to day 3 of Great Expectation. Let's get started with chapter 2 where we had left last time. My sister had a trenchant way of cutting our bread and butter for us that never varied. First, with the left hand she jammed the loaf hard and fast against her bib, where it sometimes got a pin into, and sometimes a needle, which we afterwards got into our mouths. Then she took some butter, not too much, on a knife and spread it on the loaf, in an apothecary kind of way, as if she were making a plaster, using both sides of the knife with a slapping dexterity and trimming and moulding the butter off round the crust. Then she gave the knife a final smart wipe on the edge of the plaster, and then sawed a very thick round off the loaf, which she finally, before separating from the loaf, hewed into 2 halves, of which Joe got one and I the other. On the present occasion, though I was hungry, I dared not eat my slice. I felt that I must have something in reserve for my dreadful acquaintance, and his ally, the still more dreadful young man. I knew Mrs. Joe's housekeeping to be of the strictest kind, and that my Larkinius researches might find nothing available in the safe. Therefore, I resolved to put my hunk of bread and butter down the leg of my trousers. The effort of resolution necessary to the achievement of this purpose I found to be quite awful. It was as if I had to make up my mind to leap from the top of a high house or plunge into a great depth of water. And it was made the more difficult by the unconscious Joe. In our already mentioned Freemasonry as fellow sufferers and his good-natured companionship with me, it was our evening habit to compare the way we bit through our slices by silently holding them up to each other's admiration now and then, which stimulated us to new exertions. Tonight, Joe several times invited me, by the display of his fast diminishing slice, to enter upon our usual friendly competition, but he found me each time with my yellow mug of tea on one knee and my untouched bread and butter on the other. At last, I desperately considered that the thing I contemplated must be done, and that it had best be done in the least improbable manner consistent with the circumstances. I took advantage of a moment when Joe had just looked at me and got my bread and butter down my leg. Joe was evidently made uncomfortable by what he supposed to be my loss of appetite, and took a thoughtful bite out of his slice, which he didn't seem to enjoy. He turned it about in his mouth much longer than usual, pondering over it is a good deal, and after all gulped it down like a pill. He was about to take another bite and had just got his head on one side for a good purchase on it, when his eye fell on me and he saw that my bread and butter was gone. The wonder and consternation with which Joe stopped on the threshold of his bite and stared at me were too evident to escape my sister's observation. "What's the matter now?" said she smartly as she put down her cup. "I say, you know," muttered Joe, shaking his head at me in very serious remonstrance. "Pip, old chap, you will do yourself a mischief. It will stick somewhere. You can't have chawed it, Pip." "What's the matter now?" repeated my sister more sharply than before. "If you can cuff any trifle on it up, Pip, I recommend you do it," said Joe, all aghast. "Manners is manners, but still you else your eld." By this time my sister was quite desperate, so she pounced on Joe and, taking him by the 2 whiskers, knocked his head for a little while against the wall behind him, while I sat in the corner looking guiltily on. "Now, perhaps you will mention what's the matter," said my sister, out of breath. "You staring great stuck pig." Joe looked at her in a helpless way, then took a helpless bite and looked at me again. "You know, Pip," said Joe, solemnly, with his last bite in his cheek and speaking in a confidential voice, and speaking in a confidential voice, as if we two were quite alone. You and me is always friends, and I would be the last to tell upon you any time. But such a He moved his chair and looked around the floor between us, and then again at me. Such a most uncommon bolt as that. Been bolting his foods, has he? Cried my sister. You know, old chap, said Joe, looking at me and not at Mrs. Joe, with his bite still in his cheek. I bolted myself when I was your age, frequent, and as a boy I have been among a many bolters, but I have never seen your bolting equal yet. Pip, and it's a mercy you ain't bolted dead. My sister made a dive at me and fished me up by the hair, saying nothing more than the awful words, You come along and be dosed. Some medical beast had revived tar water in those days as a fine medicine, and Mrs. Joey always kept a supply of it in the cupboard, having a belief in its virtues correspondent to its nastiness. At the best of times, so much of this elixir was administered to me as a choice restorative that I was conscious of going about smelling like a new fence. On this particular evening, the urgency of my case demanded a pint of this mixture, which was poured down my throat for my greater comfort, while Mrs. Joey held my head under her arm as a boot would be held in a boot jack. Joe got off with half a pint, but was made to swallow that, much to his disturbance, as he sat slowly munching and meditating before the fire, because he had had a turn. Judging from myself, I should say he certainly had a turn afterwards, if he had had none before. Conscience is a dreadful thing which it accuses man or boy. But when, in the case of a boy, that secret burden cooperates with another secret burden down the leg of his trousers, it is a great punishment. The guilty knowledge that I was going to rob Mrs. Joey, I never thought I was going to rob Joe, for I never thought of any of the housekeeping property as his, united to the necessity of always keeping one hand on my bread and butter as I sat, or when I was ordered about the kitchen on any small errand, almost drove me out of my mind. Then, as the marsh winds made the fire glow and flare, I thought I heard the voice outside, of the man with the iron on his leg who had sworn me to secrecy, declaring that he couldn't and wouldn't starve until tomorrow, but must be fed now. At other times, I thought, what if the young man who was with so much difficulty restrained from imbruing his hands in me should yield to a constitutional impatience, or should mistake the time, and should think himself accredited to my heart and liver tonight instead of tomorrow? If ever anybody's hair stood on end with terror, mine must have done so then, but perhaps nobody's ever did. It was Christmas Eve, and I had to stir the pudding for next day with a copper stick from 7 to 8 by the Dutch clock. I tried it with the load upon the leg, and found the tendency of exercise to bring the bread and butter out at my ankle quite unmanageable. Happily I slipped away and deposited that part of my conscience in my garret bedroom. Hark, said I, when I had done my stirring and was taking a final worm in the chimney corner before being sent up to bed. Was that great guns, Joey? Ah, said Joe, there's another convict off. What does that mean, Joe? Said I. Mrs. Joey, who always took explanations upon herself, said snappishly, escaped, administering the definition like tar water. While Mrs. Joe sat with her head bending over her needlework, I put my mouth into the forms of saying to Jay, What's a convict? Joe put his mouth into the forms of returning such a high, elaborate answer that I could make nothing out of it but the single word, Pip. There was a convict off last night, said Joey aloud, after sunset gun, And they fired warning of him, and now it appears they are firing warning of another. Who's firing? Said I. Drat that boy, interposed my sister, frowning at me over her work. What a questioner he is. Ask no questions and you will be told no lies. It was not very polite to herself, I thought, to imply that I should be told lies by her even if I did ask questions. But she never was polite unless there was company. At this point, Joe greatly augmented my curiosity by taking the utmost pains to open his mouth very wide and to put it into the form of a word that looked to me like sulks. Therefore, I naturally pointed to Mrs. Joey and put my mouth into the form of saying her. But Joe wouldn't hear of that at all and again opened his mouth very wide and shook the form of a most emphatic word out of it. But I could make nothing of the word. Mrs. Joey, said I, as a last resort, I should like to know, if you wouldn't much mind, where the firing comes from. Lord bless the boy, exclaimed my sister, as if she didn't quite mean that, but rather the contrary. From the hulks. Oh, said I, looking at Joe, hulks. Joe gave a reproachful cough, as much to say, well, I told you so. And please, what's hulks? Said I. That's the way with this boy, exclaimed my sister, pointing me out with her needle and thread and shaking her head at me. Answer him one question and he'll ask you a dozen directly. Hulks are prison ships, right across the meshes. We always use that name for marshes in our country. I wonder who's put into prison ships and why they are put there, said I in a general way and with quiet desperation. It was too much for Mrs. Joy, who immediately rose. I tell you what, young fellow, said she, I didn't bring you up by hand to badger people's life out. It would be blame to me and not praise if I had. People are put in the hulks because they murder and because they rob and forge and do all sorts of bad. And they always begin by asking questions. Now you get along to bed. Well, that's all for day 2 and see you tomorrow. Thank you.